There is a particular kind of presence that often goes unnoticed in rooms full of noise. It's the person who listens, really listens. They don't interrupt. They don't rush to fill silence. They don't compete for attention. They absorb conversations quietly, nodding, responding minimally, offering space rather than sound. And because they don't speak much, people project onto them. They assume shyness, lack of confidence, disinterest, even weakness. But the psychology of people who listen but never speak is far more complex, deliberate, and powerful than most realize. Listening without speaking is rarely accidental. It is almost never a lack of thoughts. In fact, people who listen deeply often have very active inner worlds. Their silence is not emptiness, it is containment. To understand why some people listen but rarely speak, you have to understand how they experience information. For them, words are not light. They are not casual. Words carry weight, meaning, consequence. So they don't release them easily. They want to be sure that what they say is accurate, necessary, and aligned with what they actually feel or think. Speaking prematurely feels careless. So they wait. And while they wait, they observe. Observation is a central psychological trait of quiet listeners. They notice tone before content, pattern before opinion, subtext before statement. While others are focused on being heard, they are focused on understanding. They pick up inconsistencies, emotional undercurrents, unspoken dynamics. Their silence gives them access to layers of interaction that noise obscures. This is why people who listen but never speak are often excellent judges of character. They've seen how people talk when they want something, when they're nervous, when they're trying to impress, when they're hiding. They've watched how stories change depending on the audience. Silence becomes a vantage point. Another important factor is emotional regulation. Many people speak to regulate themselves. They talk to release tension, clarify thoughts, or soothe anxiety. Quiet listeners regulate internally. They process before they express. This makes them appear calm, even when they're experiencing strong emotions. Speaking too early would disrupt that regulation, so they stay quiet. There is also a strong link between silence and psychological safety. Many people who listen but rarely speak learned early that speaking came with risk. Maybe they were interrupted, dismissed, corrected, misunderstood. Maybe their thoughts were met with ridicule or indifference. Over time, the nervous system learned that listening was safer than contributing, but safety is not the same as fear. For some, silence began as protection and later became preference. They discovered that listening gave them control. They could choose when to engage instead of reacting impulsively. Silence allowed them to stay grounded. Another misunderstood element is empathy. People who listen deeply often feel others' emotions strongly. They don't just hear words, they feel the emotional charge behind them. Speaking while absorbing that much emotional information can feel overwhelming. Silence creates space to hold what others are expressing without adding more stimulation. This is why quiet listeners are often the ones others open up to. Their presence feels non-invasive, non-competitive, safe. People sense they won't be interrupted or judged, and so they talk. Ironically, the more someone listens, the more others speak. But this creates imbalance. Over time, quiet listeners may become emotional containers for others. They hold stories, frustrations, secrets, and feelings without sharing their own. This can lead to emotional fatigue, not because they don't want connection, but because connection has become one-directional. Another psychological layer is identity. Some people don't see themselves as performers. They don't experience speaking as self-expression. They experience it as exposure. Their sense of self is private, internal, not something they feel compelled to externalize constantly. Silence preserves identity integrity. Speaking for them is not how they exist. Being is. There is also a strong relationship between listening and power. Contrary to popular belief, silence is not powerless. Silence shifts the center of gravity. When one person speaks and the other listens, the speaker reveals themselves, their values, their insecurities, their motives. The listener gathers information without giving much away. This asymmetry can feel threatening to people who equate speaking with control. That's why quiet listeners are sometimes pressured to open up or say something. Their silence disrupts social expectations, but quiet listeners don't feel incomplete in silence. They feel complete. Another reason people listen but never speak is cognitive processing speed. Not slower, but deeper. They think in layers. When a topic comes up, their mind doesn't produce a quick opinion. It branches. It considers nuance, contradictions, consequences. By the time they've arrived at something worth saying, the conversation has often moved on, so they say nothing. This doesn't mean they had nothing to contribute. It means the conversational pace didn't match their processing rhythm. This is especially true in group settings. Groups reward speed and confidence, not depth. Quick responses dominate. Thoughtful pauses are interpreted as disengagement. Quiet listeners notice this and adapt by withdrawing further, not out of insecurity, but realism. Another factor is value alignment. Many quiet listeners simply don't enjoy speaking unless it serves a purpose. They don't like filling space. They don't like talking to be seen. They speak when there's clarity, relevance, or impact. If a conversation feels superficial, repetitive, or ego-driven, they disengage internally. Silence becomes discernment. This is why quiet listeners often speak powerfully when they finally do. Their words land. They're concise, considered. People often say, "I've never thought of it that way." That's because the thought was incubated, not improvised. But because these moments are rare, others may miss how much is happening internally during silence. Another psychological dimension is autonomy. Some people resist speaking because conversation often comes with subtle demands. To agree, to take sides, to reveal positions, to commit emotionally. Silence allows autonomy. You're not pulled into narratives that don't align with you. This is especially true for people who dislike conflict or polarization. Staying silent keeps them from being misinterpreted or entangled. There is also a trauma-related aspect for some. People who experienced environments where speaking led to harm often learned to listen instead. Silence kept them safe. It allowed them to anticipate danger. Over time, hyper-attunement to others developed. Speaking felt secondary to monitoring. This pattern doesn't disappear automatically in adulthood. Silence remains familiar. Grounding. But even without trauma, many quiet listeners are simply introspective by nature. They enjoy observing life rather than narrating it. They don't feel the need to externalize every thought. Their internal dialogue is rich enough. Another misunderstood aspect is confidence. Quiet listeners are often assumed to lack confidence, but many are deeply self-assured. They don't need validation through speech. They're not measuring their worth by airtime. Their confidence is internal, not performative. Silence doesn't make them invisible to themselves, only to others. Another reason they listen but never speak is that they dislike reduction. Speaking often forces you to compress complex thoughts into simplified statements. Quiet listeners resist this. They know that nuance gets lost, so they hold complexity internally rather than dilute it publicly. This is why they may prefer writing to speaking. Writing allows precision, revision, depth. Speaking feels too fast. Listening, on the other hand, allows complexity to remain intact. Quiet listeners also tend to have strong internal ethics. They don't want to speak carelessly or irresponsibly. They are aware that words shape reality. Once spoken, they can't be taken back, so they wait until they're sure. This restraint is often mistaken for passivity. It is not. It is responsibility. Another psychological truth is that people who listen more than they speak often experience the world more intensely. Sounds, expressions, shifts in mood, all register. Constant speaking would overload them. Silence creates balance. This is why many quiet listeners need solitude to recover. Listening is active. It takes energy. And because they're always listening, they get tired without appearing to do much. If you're someone who listens but never speaks, it's important to understand this about yourself. Your silence is not a deficiency. It's a strategy, one that gives you insight, perspective, and emotional intelligence. But like all strategies, it has limits. When silence becomes default rather than choice, it can lead to invisibility, to unmet needs, to being known only as a container for others. Growth for quiet listeners is not becoming louder. It's becoming selective with voice, choosing when to speak not because you must, but because it matters to you. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, staying connected to reflections like this matters. Without understanding, quiet listeners often internalize the idea that they are less than. Subscribing isn't about becoming outspoken. It's about learning when your voice deserves space. People who listen but never speak are not empty. They are full. Full of observation, full of thought, full of restraint. They don't speak because they have nothing to say. They don't speak because they're deciding what's worth saying. And when they do speak, it's rarely noise. It's signal. Another reason people who listen but never speak remain silent is that silence allows them to stay oriented to truth rather than performance. Speaking in social settings often involves subtle theater. People exaggerate certainty, they simplify opinions. They adopt confident tones even when unsure. Quiet listeners notice this. They sense the gap between what is said and what is meant. And because they value internal coherence, they hesitate to enter a space where expression feels performative rather than sincere. They would rather be silent than speak something they don't fully stand behind. This creates an internal posture of restraint, not suppression, but selectivity. Silence becomes a filter. Only thoughts that survive internal scrutiny make it out. Everything else stays inside. Another psychological layer is that many quiet listeners experience language as inadequate. They feel that words rarely capture the full complexity of what they're thinking or feeling. When they try to speak, it feels like reduction, like flattening something dimensional into something linear. That reduction feels unsatisfying, even wrong. So they stay quiet, not because they lack language, but because language feels insufficient. This is especially true for people with abstract or integrative thinking styles. Their thoughts are not neat sentences, they are networks, associations, emotional textures. Translating that into speech requires effort and often leads to disappointment. Listening, by contrast, requires no translation. Another element is that people who listen but never speak often distrust immediacy. They don't trust first thoughts. They know that insight matures over time. What feels true in the moment may feel incomplete later. So they wait. They let ideas sit. They revisit them internally. This makes them appear disengaged in fast-paced discussions, but internally, they're working deeply. Groups often misinterpret this. Loud participation is rewarded. Silence is penalized. Over time, quiet listeners learn that their natural rhythm is out of sync with group dynamics, so they withdraw further, conserving energy rather than fighting the tempo. Another factor is emotional responsibility. Quiet listeners are often acutely aware that speaking can influence others. Words can hurt, mislead, or escalate. Because they feel that responsibility, they hesitate to speak casually. They weigh impact. This makes them cautious communicators. In emotionally charged situations, this caution increases. While others speak impulsively, quiet listeners slow down. They sense how volatile the moment is. Silence becomes a way to prevent harm. This is why quiet listeners are often the ones who de-escalate conflict, not by speaking, but by not adding fuel. Another psychological truth is that many people who listen but rarely speak have a strong internal locus of validation. They don't rely on others' reactions to confirm their thoughts. They don't need agreement to feel secure, so they don't feel compelled to voice opinions just to be acknowledged. Their sense of self does not depend on airtime. This internal validation is often mistaken for passivity, but passivity implies disengagement. Quiet listeners are engaged, just not externally expressive. Another important layer is that silence can be a form of self-respect. Some people choose silence because they don't want to participate in conversations that feel shallow, dishonest, or misaligned. They don't argue to win. They don't debate for sport. They disengage quietly. Silence becomes discernment, not avoidance. This is particularly true in environments that reward dominance over understanding. Quiet listeners sense when conversation is more about ego than truth. They step back rather than compete. There is also a relationship between listening and memory. People who listen deeply remember things others forget. Names, details, emotional nuances. They store information. This gives them long-term insight, even if it doesn't translate into immediate speech. Over time, this can create a strange dynamic. People may underestimate them, only to be surprised later by how much they noticed. Quiet listeners are often underestimated, and that gives them freedom. Another reason people listen but never speak is that silence allows them to stay whole. Speaking can fragment identity. You become the one who thinks X, or the one who said Y. Quiet listeners resist being reduced to sound bites. They want to remain complex, evolving, undefined. Silence protects that complexity. This is why they often avoid debates that demand clear sides. Life rarely fits clean categories, and they know it. Silence keeps them from being forced into false binaries. Another overlooked aspect is that many quiet listeners have strong inner dialogues. They are constantly conversing with themselves, questioning, reflecting, integrating. External conversation can feel redundant or distracting. They already have a rich internal exchange. Speaking out loud feels unnecessary unless it adds something new. There is also a physiological component. Some people have nervous systems that are more easily overstimulated by sound, especially their own. Speaking activates arousal. Silence keeps them regulated. Listening is less activating than speaking. This is why quiet listeners may feel drained after talking, even briefly. Silence conserves energy. Another psychological factor is early role assignment. Some people grew up in environments where their role was to listen, to observe, to be the calm one, the mediator, the witness. Over time, this role solidified. Speaking felt like stepping out of place. Even as adults, they may unconsciously maintain that role. This doesn't mean they lack agency. It means agency was expressed differently. Another important truth is that people who listen but never speak often experience frustration, not because they want to talk more, but because they are misunderstood. Others assume silence means agreement, ignorance, or indifference. This leads to misalignment. Decisions get made that don't reflect their perspective. Over time, this can create quiet resentment. Growth for quiet listeners involves recognizing when silence no longer serves them, when withholding voice leads to invisibility rather than insight, when listening becomes self-erasure. The challenge is not becoming loud. It's becoming intentional with voice, learning to speak when it matters to you, not when it's expected. Another aspect is relational imbalance. Quiet listeners often attract talkers, people who fill space. Over time, relationships can become one-sided. The listener knows a lot about the speaker. The speaker knows little about the listener. This imbalance can feel safe at first, but hollow later. Quiet listeners may not realize how unseen they feel until loneliness appears. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from not being known. This is why some quiet listeners eventually withdraw entirely. They feel invisible even when surrounded by people. Silence no longer feels protective. It feels isolating. At that point, something has to change. Change doesn't require abandoning listening. Listening is a strength. It requires complementing it with selective expression, sharing just enough to be known, not everything to be exposed. Another psychological truth is that silence can be mistaken for emotional distance. But many quiet listeners are emotionally present. They feel deeply. They just don't externalize easily. Others may assume they're detached when they're actually engaged. This misinterpretation can damage intimacy. Quiet listeners often crave deep connection, but struggle to create it because they don't offer enough of themselves verbally. Others don't know how to reach them. Understanding this can be painful, but also liberating. It reframes silence not as destiny, but as habit. Habits can evolve. If you are someone who listens but never speaks, your silence likely protected you at some point. It gave you space, safety, and insight. But protection can become limitation if it's never questioned. The goal is not to become someone else. It's to reclaim choice. Choice over when to listen. Choice over when to speak. Choice over how visible you want to be. When silence is chosen, it is powerful. When silence is automatic, it can be costly. Understanding the psychology of people who listen but never speak replaces judgment with clarity. It reveals that silence is not emptiness, but fullness held inward. It shows that quiet people are not lacking voice. They are rationing it. And rationing something valuable is not weakness. It's discernment. People who listen but never speak are often the ones who understand the most. They carry insight quietly. They see beneath surfaces. They notice what others miss. Their presence stabilizes rooms even when they say nothing. But presence alone is not always enough to be known, and being known matters. So the evolution of the quiet listener is not toward noise, but toward balance. Toward honoring listening as a gift and voice as a right. Toward choosing expression not to perform, but to connect. You don't need to speak more than others. You only need to speak enough to exist fully. People who listen but never speak are not invisible by nature. They become invisible when they believe silence is the only safe option. And once that belief loosens, something shifts. Silence becomes a choice again. Voice becomes available. And presence becomes mutual.